Two more to go. One is panic. So if we're talking about panic disorder, the thing about panic is that it's meant to be a sudden, recurrent, unexpected physiological experience, right, and emotional experience. So sudden and unexpected, right? Typically, panic peaks within a few minutes of being aware of it, and it has both physical and cognitive components, like worry components to it, and it lasts for a while. But what's really important around autism is that it makes a lot of sense, depending on the child we're talking about, that they're going to experience panic symptoms, feel stressed out about things. But it might not be unexpected. You or parent might know very well what situations will always set this person off. Always have and always will, right? If you can't, there has to be some instance where the experience or the manifestation of panic is unexpected and came upon suddenly. So if the story is always one of a mild agitation that lasts for a significant period of time and results in very aggressive behavior and a lot more kind of perceptive hand flapping and other kind of behaviors, it's probably not what we think of as panic, right? It's an extreme response, an escalation of the behaviors, but panic comes on rather suddenly. Okay, that's an important differentiating feature. Here's a model of what we typically teach, right, in general CBT when we're trying to teach somebody about panic. If they have panic, right, so remember, CBT is very educative. We want people to know what we know, right? So we walk them through the model and we kind of say, so typically there's a trigger. At some point there's a trigger that you might not have been aware of, right? An external trigger that leads to some type of physical symptom of panic. Right? All panic starts this way. I drank my coffee, my heart rate, so the trigger there is kind of drinking that coffee. Right? Let's say, and about to come up on stage. I'm going to give myself a panic attack now as I go. And then that physical symptom, I get typically, there's some type of very quick thought about it, negative thought. Right? Uh-oh, this is uncomfortable, this is bad. Even something as simple as that, to something bigger, like I'm going to have a heart attack. But there's some type of negative appraisal. I could have that same physical sensation and think, I'm so excited right now. I can't wait to get up there, right? It's the same physiology. If I go on a roller coaster tomorrow, I'm going to have the same physiological reactions, whether I say to myself, I'm going to die, or I'm going to have the best time of my life. So one is the physical reaction, physical symptoms, physical reaction to my trigger, the roller coaster. The other one is my appraisal of the situation, right? Depending on what I do there, it changes my focus. If I get very angry, if I see this physical symptom as presentation of something negative, then I actually focus my attention more on it because my attention I use my attention as a spotlight on what I need to be safe from. And that leads to more physical symptoms, which leads to at some point, a catastrophic thought. At some point, which leads to more physical symptoms. And around we go until our body actually goes through the whole process of panic and then homeostasis. Panic doesn't typically last for a long period of time after its onset because it's impossible for our bodies to maintain that state. It goes back, it resets. Okay? So that's another thing. You're not going to see panic for hours on end with no abatement. Right? You might see an increase and then an abatement and then an increase and an abatement, but there's typically an abatement before the next occurrence of a panic attack. Okay? So we teach this. If you've identified panic, you can teach part of this to kids with autism, right? Or people with autism who are experiencing panic, even if they don't have very strong verbal skills, by making this a lot more visual in nature. Putting the physical symptoms, visuals of the physical symptoms out, right? This can become one word or a frowny face, right? You can have different ways just to separate the thought from the physical symptom, right? That could become you don't even need this part. You can skip this. You can go straight to that because you know it's there. You might not need to explain about attention and instead go to this part. The point here is that this is the typical model that still helps us convey what panic is to parents and to people with autism who are going through panic attacks. Okay? Part of panic is be aware of, is it always expected? If it's always expected and you know exactly when it's going to happen, and parents do too, then the strategy becomes one of focusing on those specific triggers because we know it's always going to be those triggers. In typical panic, though, it generalizes beyond any specific trigger. It no longer is about the roller coaster or the public speaking. It generalizes because that's what fear does. Uncontrolled fear and anxiety, it tries to keep us safe. So it does what most safety things do. It draws a gate around the gate, and then a gate around that, and then a boundary around that. Why not? If my job is to keep you safe, the better thing than one moat is two moats, right? And then a wall, and then another moat. So that's what we do. That's what anxiety does. It's trying to help. So in this case, it goes beyond the trigger typically. And if that's the case, you don't want to get stuck on the expected events because then you're just putting a finger in the dam. You're not actually addressing. At some point, the trigger becomes irrelevant in panic, right? Because it generalizes. And so then what's the trigger in panic? If it's not the trigger, what then becomes the trigger? Great, the physical symptoms. And what's our treatment then? Think about behavioral interventions, right? What would our treatment be? It's not the trigger anymore, because the trigger's not actually the contingency that matters. If the trigger is now the physiological symptoms, how do we help people around panic? Especially if they don't have words where we can communicate all of this, what are we going to do? Exposure to the symptoms, so interoceptive exposure, but it wouldn't necessarily be that nice for us to, like I do often, like you put a baseball bat and you get them to spin around, right? Maybe we can make it a little bit fun and natural in some ways. Maybe we go on a roller coaster together, right? Maybe we do lots of high fives and a lot of positive experiences around and we play tag, right? Maybe you as the therapist do it with them. So both of you are sweating up a storm. Right? And you keep doing this regularly outside of that contingency of the fear response, pairing it with a positive response, a positive evaluation. Okay? One thing that Susan White often talks about, and I really like this one, is many times families will be bringing their kids to the doctor for a lot of somatic complaints, like heart racing, uncomfortable pain, and so on. And she suggests that in kids who can't articulate their thoughts and their worries, that might be actually the first indicator that this kid might be having panic attacks. If they're regularly going to the doctor and there's no actual physical kind of issues at play, and the symptoms are very somatic in nature, that might be panic. Interesting. Now, agoraphobia, of course, is associated with panic, but it can also happen without this fear of the agora, right? The fear of the open space. So that can make sense that if you're having panic attacks, one of the best things you could do quickly is to avoid being in places where people will see you having panic. You stay in the safest place ever, right? So you start to avoid, and then you generalize not to your physical symptoms, but to open spaces, to outside environments. So it becomes agoraphobia. You can also have agoraphobia without panic, where there's a fear for other reasons of those outside places, or being trapped in spaces, not being able to escape, etc. And how do you know this? Well, you have to have a very good sense of where people avoid, the content of their avoidance. Right? And ask specific questions about outside areas. Is it specific to school? What about elevators? And if it is generalized, then there could be agoraphobia. So look for the reasons for the avoidance. Okay? If a person can go out, here's a little trick again. If a person can go into an environment with a caregiver, for example, who functions as a reassurance support, where they can constantly, if the person's saying, goes in the environment, okay, and every time that the person says that, the caregiver says, it's okay. That person might be able to go into the environment, but it's because they're constantly reassurance seeking, right? So that you might not see the avoidance because they always have that reassurance person there, okay? So you have to ask yourself, what if this person wasn't here? What would be the response? If somebody else was there who didn't have that kind of reassurance role, that safety signal role.